Namaste and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Sunday service. Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityormamritam Gamaya Avirmaedhi Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Tena Mam Pahi Nityam Tena Mam Pahi Nityam. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourself, O Lord, and protect us evermore from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. Om Vishnur Va Tripurantako Bhavatu Va Brahma Surendrotha Va Bhanurva Shashalakshanota Bhagavan Buddhota Siddhota Va Ragadvesha Visharati Moharahita Sattvanukampodyato Yassarve Sahasamskrito Gunaganais Tasmai Namah Sarvada. The Supreme Reality and its messengers are known by various names in various traditions. But as for me, I offer my worship always to the one going by any name and belonging to any tradition that is free from attachment and hatred, free from worldliness and delusion, who is filled with compassion towards all living beings, and who is possessed of all noble virtues. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om Peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So this morning the talk is on Swami Vivekananda in honor of his solar calendar birthday, meaning his birthday in accordance with the solar calendar, which the Western calendar follows. It's not the only solar calendar, but it follows the days, the progress of the sun, based on the solar cycle. And so that would be January 12th, this past Tuesday. So last Sunday, we had the worship of Swami Vivekananda in honor of his solar calendar birthday. And today I want to speak on him because last week it was a worship rather than a talk. Of course, most of the things that we say, certainly the things that I talk about, are all influenced by my understanding of Swami Vivekananda. And so, in a sense, every lecture and every class that I give is in celebration of Swami Vivekananda. Because whatever understanding I have, it's based on my understanding of Swamiji. And I emphasize my understanding because Swamiji was so vast, as I will come back to in a moment. But first, let me say that the actual title for the talk is, Will the Real Swami Vivekananda Please Stand Up? Now, some of you will recognize that this is taken from a line in a game show. I had no idea that the old game show that I knew in the 50s and 60s when I was a kid growing up, called To Tell the Truth, had continued up into present times. I thought that it ended back in the 60s. So the first version of the game show, or the quiz show, rather than a game show, it really was characterized as a quiz show. The first incarnation was from 1956 to 1968, which covered my conscious years of childhood. The earliest years of childhood, of course, you don't form much in the way of memories, but from the time I was 6 until 18, Was the first the period during which this show in its first incarnation came out. And it was a very popular quiz show, and like many families, our family watched it regularly. There were three quiz shows that were very popular at that time. One was To Tell the Truth, one was I've Got a Secret, and the third was What's My Line? But of those three, To Tell the Truth, again, has continued in various incarnations up to the present time. In my day, the program that I remember, I've never seen it since, actually not since 1967 when I went to Sweden and didn't have television. After that, I've been absent from television from 1967 on. But the old show that I knew was very simple as far as television goes. When you look at old television shows, it's amazing how things have changed. Taste and styles have changed. But in those days, and part of this is continued with the program apparently from what I see on Wikipedia, there was a person who, there were three people that would come out and sit, and then there were four guest celebrities like Peggy Cass and Jane Meadows and Kitty Carlisle, Don Poston. They were celebrities, known people who would try to guess which of these three people were telling the truth. So there'd be three people at a table, and one of them had a true story which was narrated by the narrator. And then the contestants could ask these three people questions to try to figure out which one of them that story applied to. So they would ask a variety of questions, and two of the people who were not that person, they were free to lie as they liked, pretending that they were that person. But the person who was the real person, he had to tell the truth. So in that way, they would try to guess which one of them the story applied to, and at the end, they would vote on which one they thought had been telling the truth. And so then they would ask, will the real Mr. X or Miss X please stand up? And so the three contestants would move like they were going to get up. One would move and then sit down, and the other would move and sit down. A third one would move, and they'd do that for a moment. And then finally, one of them would stand up and reveal that they were the one that the story applied to. So that's the background for the title, Will the Real Swami Vivekananda Please Stand Up? A reference which many years ago, many people would know. I don't know how many of you, or to how many of you the title is meaningful now. So why the title about Swami Vivekananda? Because to tell who Swami Vivekananda was, the real Swami Vivekananda, that's a Herculean task. It's very difficult. It's difficult to know even another ordinary human being like you or me. We are socially, we may be social friends and so forth. We may get together, we may work together, we may play together, have a long association. But how much do we really know of another person? One of the things that I, as a Swami in the Ramakrishna mission, was long ago surprised by, I should say, was that the devotees who had come to centers where I have lived, and I'm talking about 30, 40 years ago, devotees that I got to know well, but they would come to the center as devotees. And then on some occasion, I would happen to see the same devotee in their professional setting. And I would be amazed, oh, this is the same person that comes so humbly and devoutly to the center, and that we think that we are teaching something to. And this is a person who's quite accomplished. They know so much. They're so professionally accomplished. They're people who look up to them. They may be mentors to other people. And all I knew was this simple devotee who used to come and ask questions about Vedanta and so forth. So even knowing another ordinary human being is difficult. How many dimensions a person has. As Sri Ramakrishna used to say, of course, there was another point he was making, but the example serves well here. He would say that the same man may be a judge in the court, he may be a father to his children, he may be a husband to his wife, he may be a friend to his neighbors, he may be a child to his parents. In all of those relationships, he's a different person. Or to each of those people, he's a different person. And no one of those other people associated with him knows all of those aspects fully. The wife may know that he's the son of his parents, but doesn't know exactly how the parents look on him and what all the parents know about him and what the parents assume about him. And so with the other relationships. So even to know an ordinary person is completely is impossible here. And what to speak of someone like Swami Vivekananda. Another problem with knowing a person is, as Carl Jung showed, the great psychologist showed, what we feel, we ordinary people, what we feel inside, we project the opposite outside. That what we feel about ourselves inside, we project to the opposite outside. Now, as a person practices spiritual discipline, they become more and more transparent. But the ordinary person who has not practiced spiritual discipline, again, a person who is very egotistical, who's always talking about me, and pushing themselves forward. The truth about a very egotistical person is that they have a very weak sense of self. And so they're always asserting it because they're not sure of themselves. A person who is a bully is a person who's very fearful and weak inside, very insecure. And so they go around pushing other people around before other people have a chance to push them around. And so, as Carl Jung said, we tend to project outside the opposite of what we feel inside. And so that also makes it difficult to understand an ordinary person. So when we come to somebody like Swami Vivekananda, the problem is much greater than knowing one of us. It's not just that he was multidimensional. Everyone is multidimensional, but Swami Vivekananda was like what we call a Renaissance man, somebody who had so many sides to him, and well-developed aspects to his person, to his mind, to his personality. But it was not just that he was more multidimensional than most of us. Each of his dimensions was vast. Everything about Swami Vivekananda was vast. In one sense, he was much easier to know than the rest of us, and that's because he was completely transparent. And that, again, as I said before, as we practice spiritual discipline, the masks that we wear to protect ourselves in society, those begin to fall away. And then we become what is called simple in the good sense, in the spiritual sense, not in the sense of somebody who's not very smart, but simple in the sense of simple-hearted. Sorol in Bengali, Sri Ramakrishna used to speak very highly of those who were sorol, that is simple, straightforward, transparent, like Swami Adbhutananda, Latu Maharaj. Sri Ramakrishna had a great love for him because of his utter simplicity. So Swami Vivekananda, in that sense, was utterly simple, utterly transparent, and yet he was so difficult to know for these other reasons, because he was so vast and so multidimensional, and each dimension being vast. And so it's difficult, as I always say when speaking directly about Swami Vivekananda, which I usually do around his birthday and around the 4th of July. It's difficult speaking about him because when one speaks about Swamiji, one tends to use only superlatives. I remember when I first joined the order and I was at the monastery in Ganges, Michigan, far out in the country in southwestern Michigan, fruit farming country. So there were varying numbers of us as people came and tried the monastery and left, but 4 or 5 of us that were constant for several years. And so at one time when I was fairly new, I'd only been there maybe for 6 months or so, we would read at the mealtime. at the night meal. And so we would read, at one time we read from the life of Swami Vivekananda, and starting from his childhood, of course. And in the life, the life was so full of superlatives that Swamiji was an expert at this, and he was a great at that, and he topped his class in this, and he was better than other boys at that. And so we would all laugh because we thought, "Oh, this is ridiculous. It's just a long string of superlatives. They don't need to go on and on describing his superlatives." But later, of course, I saw that that is the problem. When you speak about Swami Vivekananda, you can't speak in small terms. You can't speak in ordinary terms because everything about him was extraordinary. Uh, and so, because he was so vast, we have to pick and choose what we want to say. And because he was so vast, none of us can claim that we really understand him. And so we have to pick and choose what we say, and we have to speak from our own standpoint. Swami Ramakrishnananda asked Sister Nivedita, the great Irish-English disciple of Swamiji, who gave her life to India, to the uplift of Indian women in particular. Swami Ramakrishnananda asked her to write the biography of Swami Vivekananda because he said that no one has understood, even us, the other direct disciples, no one has understood him as you have understood him. So you please write his life. And Sister Nivedita said, that's impossible. I can't possibly try to comprehend Swamiji. I can write my understanding of him. That's all that I can write. And as a result, she produced one of the most beautiful books we have in our literature called The Master as I Saw Him. The Master as I Saw Him, and another book called Notes on Some Wanderings with the Swami Vivekananda about her travels through India with Swamiji. So these two books are what she came out with, but she didn't attempt to write a biography. It was just her acquaintance with the Swami and what she saw of him. And so that's what even a person who understood him better than anyone else, of course, outside of Sri Ramakrishna or Holy Mother, but one who understood him better than anyone else, what she was reduced to doing. Luckily, others later did write the biography of Swami Vivekananda, so we have a biographical narrative collecting as much information as we have of him, which is very valuable. But Sister Nivedita, perhaps because she was so close to him, she was more aware than most of how impossible it was to try to contain him within a narrative. So the difficulty of speaking of him and the necessity of speaking from a personal standpoint. So let me begin to speak more directly about him from my personal standpoint. When I first became introduced to Vedanta through books, I first read a book of essays on Vedanta, the book that's no longer published, but it was a wonderful book called Vedanta for the Western World. It was a collection of articles from the Hollywood Vedanta magazine or the journal, Vedanta and the West, which originally had been called Vedanta for the Western World, the journal itself. And so these were articles from the early years of publication of that journal, which stopped publication back in the end of the 60s, or I think the early 70s. Shortly after I joined, it stopped publication. But the book was essays from the book. So I read that, and it told about Vedanta. It mentioned Swami Vivekananda and Sri Ramakrishna. But I didn't get any idea of who Swami Vivekananda was or his importance. And then for another year, almost year and a half, I couldn't find more books on Vedanta. In those days, there was no internet, there was no Amazon. And certainly Barnes and Noble and such bookstores that existed at that time, they didn't carry Swami Vivekananda's books. But finally, after a year and a half, I found a bookstore in Berkeley, California, that had a Shambhala bookstore on Telegraph Avenue, which had a whole wall of books on Hinduism. And so I picked out about 6 or 7 books from the books on Hinduism, and all of them ended up being books published by the Ramakrishna Order. So I took them as I hitchhiked back home to the East Coast and read them, and then decided that I wanted to join a monastic life and a Vedantic monastic life. So I ended up coming to the Chicago Center to join, having read these books. And I had been asked by the head of the Chicago Center at that time, before I came, to read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and the Eternal Companion Towards the Goal Supreme by Swami Vivekananda. So all of these books, which Vivekananda's name would come up, but it did none of them told about Swami Vivekananda. So I knew something by the time I joined about Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Brahmananda, and a little bit about Vedanta, and practically nothing about Swamiji, except in one of those books I had read where the author said something about Swamiji which made Swamiji sound unappealing. It quoted one of Swamiji's most beautiful letters, but quoted it out of context and without, and I had no knowledge of Swamiji to understand a context to put it in. And so the quotation was from one of his most beautiful letters written in April 1900 to Josephine MacLeod, in which he speaks about his present experience. But that wasn't quoted. What was quoted was where he says something to the effect of, behind my purity was fear, behind my leadership was pride, behind my this was the... And so he went on talking about how he had been dominated by ego, pride, fear, all of these things. And I thought, well, why should I be interested in such a person? I'm not interested in him. I'd rather follow somebody like Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Brahmananda, who are great spiritual lights. And so I came to the Vedanta Society in Chicago with that understanding. And when I got there, the Swami was not present for the first 2 days I was there. And so a devotee who looked after the library in those days, Barbara, she saw me down in the library on my first night and asked me about myself. And then she asked me how I had come. And I said, through books. And she asked me what I had read. And she said, well, you haven't read anything about Swami Vivekananda. And so I said, no, I'm not so interested in him. I'm more interested in Ramakrishna and Swami Brahmananda. And she said, well, the name of our society is the Vivekananda Vedanta Society of Chicago. So you should know something about him anyway. And I said, well, I don't know what to read. So she went to the bookshelf and pulled out Swami Nikhilananda's Life of Swami Vivekananda and said, well, here, start with this. So I took it to my room and I started reading, and I was immediately won over to Swamiji. I saw how completely wrong my understanding had been. I saw I just became a complete devotee of Swamiji. He became the hero of my life, which he's continued to be all of these more than 50 years now. So that led to, for the next 12, 14 years, I hardly even paid attention to Sri Ramakrishna because I was so enamored of Swami Vivekananda. So what was it that attracted me to him as I began to read about him? And then I read through his complete works, and then I read anything that I could find about him, his the reminiscences of him and so forth. So one thing was that I saw that he spoke to me as a Westerner. The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna I liked, and some Westerners, that's their favorite book from the beginning. But it wasn't for me. It took me a long time before I felt as comfortable with the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna because it was culturally so foreign to my own experience. I had international experience. It wasn't that I was so parochial that I couldn't understand it. No, I had lived in Europe and had studied many things and seen many things. But Swami Vivekananda, and I had liked the gospel when I first read it. But then when I read Swami Vivekananda and saw that he spoke to me directly as a Westerner in terms that were directed to a Western audience, then I felt an intimacy with him. Sri Ramakrishna, I could see the beauty of the man and the beauty of his teachings, but it was in a foreign setting that was foreign to me at that time. But Swamiji spoke to me as a Westerner, and I felt that he spoke to me personally, that what I needed, what I was looking for, what I was seeking, that he presented it in clear and understandable terms. Not clear and understandable in the sense that it was beginning and superficial and sort of a Vedanta 101 or something, a spiritual life 101, and later you need to go on to deeper things. No. He presented the deepest, most profound truths, but he presented them in a way that went directly to my heart. I didn't have to do any cultural translation. And then there was his heroic character, which many people, of course, everyone who comes to Swami Vivekananda notices the heroic dimension of his character. In fact, that's what turns some people off, people who, for whatever reason, that's not what they like, and they're turned off by that. But for me, that was wonderful also, because in the West, well, we're brought up worshiping heroism. And in the absence of true heroes, people began to idolize sports figures and movie stars and people like that in modern times. In older literature, true heroes were presented. But scholarship and the modern sensibility, both together, have debunked many of the old heroes that we had and told us that, oh, they weren't so great people after all. And so we're left with sports heroes and movie stars and movie fantasies, Star Wars and so forth. Not that those aren't good, those are good, Star Wars and Star Trek, but they're not real heroes that we can hold as ideals to mold our own lives. But here in Swami Vivekananda, I found a real hero, a man who lived up to the idea of a hero completely, 100%, and a hero that I could believe in. And then he was bold, of course, his heroic being. He was bold, but he was also very, very humorous, funny, and free. There was a freedom about him. There was nothing stilted, nothing formal about him. One of his brother disciples who came to this country at his Swami Vivekananda's invitation and spent many, many years here, Swami Abhedananda, himself a great soul who spent more than 20 years here in America. Whereas Swamiji was here just for several years. Let's see, from 93 to 96, about 4.5 years maybe. I can't add it up in my head now, stop now and add it up in my head, but it was between 4 and 5 years he was here. Swami Abhedananda here for 20 years. And yet Swami Abhedananda, with him, you find that he was always very formal. There was a formality about him. But Swamiji was completely at home here. He was like an American among Americans, and yet completely true to his own cultural ideals and spiritual ideals, and yet completely at home here as well. And so he was bold, he was funny, he was free, he was at ease. And wherever I touched him, I found him blending into the infinite. That is, that everything about him was vast. Nothing about him was small. Nothing about him was picayune. Nothing about him was insignificant. Everything about him was vast. And so basically in him I found the image of the perfect man. And that was what won me over to him, the image of the perfect man living in flesh, someone who had lived here in America, spoken to American audiences. Then I went within a year, I went to India for initiation, but I was just there for 28 days. I fell in love with the country that time, love which has lasted to the present, but it was just a short visit. And most of it spent moving from town to town. And so I didn't have a deep acquaintance with the culture. But then when I went back in 1975, after 5 years in the monastery in Michigan, I went back to stay and live at the training center in Bellarmine, the seminary where the young monks are trained. We're taught Sanskrit, and those who don't know Bengali learn Bengali. The Bengalis have to take Hindi lessons to learn Hindi, and the others have to learn Bengali and Sanskrit. We study the scriptures. And we study the basic Ramakrishna Vivekananda Sarada Devi literature. So as part of our formation. And so there in training center, I was shocked to see that the Swami Vivekananda who was presented in the training center was very different from the Swamiji that I knew and had come to love. It was a real shock to see that for them, the brahmacharyas in the training center and the acharyas, that is the teachers in the training center, the Swamiji they were presenting was quite foreign to me. They presented Swamiji as a great patriot, the Hindu hero who went to foreign lands and conquered foreign lands and presented the glory of India and the glory of Hinduism. That hadn't struck me before because I was reading Swamiji, his life and his teachings, as this great man who had come and spoken my own language and taught me the principles of Vedanta as a person who was very familiar to me. Later, I came to understand that yes, they were right, that that also is another aspect of Swamiji. So, though it came as a shock, I found that yes, he is a national hero for India, a national hero who came at a time when India was a slave nation under the boot of Great Britain. And the nationalist movement, the freedom movement, I should say, the freedom movement had not yet taken full birth. It was really under the influence of Swami Vivekananda going to the West and coming back to India that created a foment in India, and out of that grew the freedom movement within India. And so it's recognized that he was the great force who inspired the nascent move for India's political freedom. And so he is a national hero. Now, when you go to India, this wasn't true when I went in the 70s, but now when you go to India, you see statues of Swami Vivekananda everywhere. Big cities, mid-sized towns, and even sometimes in small towns, you see statues of Swami Vivekananda in so many places. And so he was the great, he's presented as the great patriot saint. A saint, yes, but a saint who was full of love for his mother, India, and he was the defender of India. And so that, yes, that I knew from my studies of Swamiji that when he first came to this country, he had to face down the missionaries who tried to drive him out, who tried to destroy his work by argument and by dirty means as well. They tried everything to destroy his work and get rid of him by means both fair and foul, and eventually mostly foul when the fair means didn't work. And so he was also the father of the Hindu Renaissance within India. That is the cultural renaissance of everything Hindu, where new art movements, musical movements, standing on the ancient traditions of India, but developing new forms of art, new forms of music, and so forth. So a real cultural renaissance took place in India through the influence of Swami Vivekananda. And yes, there were other influences as well, but I feel sure in time history will look back as we have more distance to see things in perspective. Historians will look back and see that Swami Vivekananda was really the force that brought about that cultural renaissance as well as the freedom movement. And the freedom movement is recognized by many already. So I eventually came to recognize that Swami Vivekananda is much, much larger, much more complex than what I had known of him. Again, I had approached him in my own way, understanding what I saw of him and what I understood of him. But then I saw that no, other people see in the same person, legitimately see a different aspect of the same great man, and that no one viewpoint, no collection of viewpoints can contain the being of Swami Vivekananda. And so again, the title of the talk, Will the Real Vivekananda Please Stand Up? Because each of us sees in him something different, and different cultures will see in him something different. An American may see Swamiji in one way because of certain things that he said, that he did, the certain things that he manifested. A Frenchman may see something different. I remember years ago, before the fall of the Soviet Union, there was I forget whether it was Chelikov, I think it was Chelikov, a Russian scholar who had made it one of his main life studies was Swami Vivekananda. And he saw in Swami Vivekananda a great revolutionary who was bringing in the proletarian revolution because he saw same-sidedness everywhere. He saw the same Brahmanan everywhere. And so he saw Swami Vivekananda in revolutionary terms, Marxist terms, and yet he had great, great regard for him. And he said, I remember this one line of his, said in an essay, that in America they think that they will, some followers of Swami Vivekananda think that it is in America that Swamiji's vision of the equality of all will be manifested. But no, it will be here in the Soviet Union under Marxist principles that we will realize the dream of Swami Vivekananda. And I appreciated that. I liked it because it showed that he had that pride, but pride in Swami Vivekananda. Yes, pride for his own country, for his own culture and everything, but it was pride tied to his pride in Swami Vivekananda, that sense of ownership of Swamiji. Again, not that anyone can own him or contain him completely, but that sense that he had that Swamiji is ours. Yes, not exclusively, certainly, but that sense that he is ours. That's a wonderful thing. So Swamiji will be seen and appreciated in different ways by different people. So now let me say something about the way those who knew him best saw him. So I'll read a few passages. First, Sri Ramakrishna. I always like to read this when celebrating Swami Vivekananda's birth. It's Sri Ramakrishna's explanation of or his narration of the vision which he had of Swami Vivekananda before he had ever seen him, the revelation that he had of the one that was that would come to join him long before Swami Vivekananda actually came to him. He said, speaking of his spiritual experience, "One day I saw that through samadhi, my mind was going up by a luminous path." Now notice as I read, I won't stop every sentence, but I will stop a couple of times or so. But as I read that Sri Ramakrishna is explaining a spiritual experience he had, but he's using familiar terms in order to give us a way to understand what it was he experienced. So he says that he was traveling along a luminous path, and he will develop that all through what he's saying here. And so that gives us a way to mentally picture it. But we should understand that what he was giving us for our understanding is not that he saw a path with bushes on the side and things like that. He'll talk about a fence between the divisible and the indivisible. Well, no, there's no barbed wire or any other kind of fence between the divisible and the indivisible. But again, he's using common metaphors to explain that which was a indescribable experience. So again, starting over, one day I saw that through samadhi, my mind was going up by a luminous path, going beyond the gross world, studded with the sun, the moon, and the stars. That is this whole universe that we see of the senses, including the sun, moon, and stars, going beyond this. It entered, first of all, into the subtle world of ideas. The more it began to ascend to subtler and subtler strata of that realm, the realm of ideas, the more did I see beautiful ideal forms of deities existing on both sides of the path. It came gradually to the last extremity of that region of subtle ideas. I saw a barrier of light, actually he said a fence of light, there separating the realm of the divisible from that of the indivisible, the khanda from the akhanda in Sanskrit. I saw leaping over that luminous fence, that barrier, The mind entered by degrees the realm of the indivisible. I saw there were no more any person or thing having a form. As if afraid to enter there, even the gods and goddesses possessing heavenly bodies exercised their authority only over realms far below. But the very next moment, I saw 7 wise rishis having bodies consisting of divine light only, seated there in samadhi. There are no persons, no things. This is the realm of the indivisible. And yet, what does it mean to see 7 sages in the luminous bodies seated there? So again, it doesn't mean he's giving us an image that we can understand in our minds, but we have to understand that this is something which is beyond comprehension in actuality. I felt that in virtue and knowledge, love and renunciation, these 7 sages had excelled even the gods and goddesses, not to speak of human beings. Astonished, I was pondering over their greatness when I saw before me that a part of that homogeneous mass of light of the abode of the indivisible, devoid of the slightest tinge of differentiation, became solidified and converted into the form of a divine child. Coming down to one of those rishis, sages, and throwing its soft and delicate arms around his neck, the divine child embraced him, and afterwards calling him with its ambrosial words, sweeter than the music of the veena, made great efforts to wake him up from his samadhi. The rishi woke up at the delicate and loving touch and looked on at that wonderful child with half-shut, unwinking eyes. That is, there was no blinking of his eyes. Seeing his bright face full of delight at the sight of the child, I thought that the child was the treasure of his heart and that their familiarity was a matter of eternity. The extraordinary divine child then expressed infinite joy and said to him, I am going. You must come with me. The rishi said nothing at that request, but his loving eyes expressed his hearty assent. Afterwards, looking on the child with loving eyes, he entered again into samadhi. Astonished, I then saw a part of the mind and body of that rishi converted into a bright light, came down to earth along the reverse path. Hardly had I seen Narendra for the first time than I knew that he was that rishi. And when he was asked, Sri Ramakrishna said that he himself was that divine child which took form out of the infinite divine light in that realm of the indivisible. And so that's what he said about the origin of Swami Vivekananda. So he used to say that Swamiji was one of the 7 primordial sages in Hindu mythology. And we find that many elements of Hindu mythology were realized in Sri Ramakrishna's life. That is, it was living mythology, not just made up stories, but a living mythology. So in Hindu mythology, it's said that Brahma, the creator, he created 7 sons. And these 7 sons were great sages because they were the first creations of the creator Brahma himself. Actually, first Brahma created 4 sons, and those sons remained in samadhi, and so creation couldn't go on. And so then he created 7 more, and they became the 7 primordial sages whose meditation sustains the universe. It is their meditation, their beneficent influence over the universe that keeps this as a cosmos, keeps the running of the universe. And so Swami Vivekananda was one of those primordial sages, according to Sri Ramakrishna. And sometimes Sri Ramakrishna would say he was the great sage Nara. Nara means, the root meaning of Nara is man. And so there is another myth in Hinduism that Narayana, God divided himself, the indivisible divided itself into Nara and Narayana. Narayana being God and Nara being man. And so Swami Vivekananda was the great sage Nara, the primordial man. So that means he was the ideal man. He was the ideal human being. Sri Ramakrishna also used to say that his Narendra, our Vivekananda, was a partial incarnation of Shiva himself. And he saw at the time of Swamiji's birth, he said that, of course, he didn't know anything. He didn't know Swamiji's family or anything about them at that time. But he was expecting this person who was to come to join him. And so he said at the time of his birth, he saw a great light coming from the direction of Benares through the sky and landing in Calcutta. And he knew that the one whom he had called had taken birth. And so he looked on him as an incarnation of Shiva. And so of all of his disciples, he would give all of his disciples the chance to serve him, knowing that by serving the teacher, a great good comes to the disciple. But he would not allow, wouldn't take any service from Swamiji. Because he had such great love and respect for Swamiji, he wouldn't allow him to serve him. He treated him as a disciple, he taught him, he trained him, but he wouldn't take any service from him because of the deep recognition of who Swamiji was. So Sri Ramakrishna used to say that Swamiji was the greatest man ever born, the greatest man ever born. Now you may say, well, what about Sri Ramakrishna himself? What about Krishna, etc.? Well, they are in the realm of the incarnations of God. But as far as a person who is not a direct incarnation of God in the classical sense of a Krishna, a Ramakrishna, he said that he was the greatest man ever born. No one had ever been born with the capacities of Swami Vivekananda and the power of him. Was that an exaggeration? Was it an example of Oriental hyperbole? Always exaggerating for making a big effect. But no, Sri Ramakrishna, there's no evidence that he was exaggerating. So though we may not understand it yet, in time that will unfold, as Swami Vivekananda himself knew, that what he had brought to earth, that it would take 1,500 years for the world to unfold that which he had brought. And so that is only beginning now. Sri Ramakrishna sometimes said that he was like the person who at a show came on the stage only to introduce the main act. So he said that he had been born to introduce Swami Vivekananda to the world. Now, such extraordinary things Sri Ramakrishna said about Swamiji. In fact, Swamiji didn't like it at all, Narendra. He scolded Sri Ramakrishna for speaking in what he said were such exaggerated terms. He said, I'm just the son of Vishwanath Datta. People will think that you're mad talking like this. And yet Sri Ramakrishna would say, what can I do? The mother has shown me all of this. I'm only speaking what mother has shown me is to be the truth. So once Sri Ramakrishna asked him late in their association, 5 or 6 years of association, late in that time when Sri Ramakrishna's end was not too far away, he asked Swamiji what his ideal was. And Swamiji said, I want to live in the state of samadhi and only come down once in a while in order to eat something to sustain the body and then to go back into samadhi and remain in samadhi, the highest state of awareness. And Sri Ramakrishna said, Dhik, fie on you, that's a very low, mean ideal. So that which for us would be an extremely high ideal, something that we can't even imagine attaining such an ideal. But Sri Ramakrishna told Swamiji that for you, that's a very low ideal, very mean ideal. I thought you were meant for much greater things than that. I thought that you would be a great banyan tree under which thousands of people would find shelter, that would give shelter to countless people. And so eventually that's what Vivekananda became. He realized in time that, yes, he was meant for much more than his personal salvation. He was meant to be a giant tree that gave shade to countless people for long centuries. And uh, some have said that Swami Vivekananda was Sri Ramakrishna's Saint Paul. As Saint Paul was to Christ, so Swami Vivekananda was to Sri Ramakrishna. Now, Saint Paul was a great saint. He was a very great saint, a great mystic, a true man of God with a true mystic knowledge. And the record indicates that he either had Nirvikalpa Samadhi or something very close. But he was a great, a great mystic. But that's not at all an appropriate comparison. Swami Vivekananda was far greater, and time will show that he was far greater than St. Paul. St. Paul never even saw Jesus except in spiritual vision. And that was a transformative vision which changed the whole direction of his life. His whole being was transformed in the light of the transcendent Christ, or the living Christ, and not the incarnate Christ. And so he was a great soul. But if you read the letters of St. Paul and the things that he did, you find that Swami Vivekananda was far, far greater than that. So I'm not trying to push St. Paul down in order to push Swami Vivekananda up. We don't need to do that. I recognize St. Paul as a great saint. But Swami Vivekananda was of a different order than that. He was not in the same class. So Holy Mother said that Swamiji was the incarnation of India itself. And that's a wonderful statement, the idea that Swamiji was the incarnation of India. India not as a political nation state as she has become in modern times, but India as a civilization. He was the incarnation of the civilization of India. And so as I tell people, if you want to understand India, read Swami Vivekananda. So no, by reading him, you won't understand the intricacies of modern Indian politics and Bollywood and so many things about India and the struggles that are going on in India right now. But if you want to understand the real India, the deep India, under the surface tensions that you find in the country right now, then read Swami Vivekananda. And then these surface tensions that you see, those will be seen in the true context. Without knowing the deep India, all of this is just noise. So read Swami Vivekananda, especially his lectures from Colombo to Almora, the lectures he gave in India. But not just that. Everything that he did and spoke was a manifestation of the real India. And so he was, in truth, the incarnation of India herself. Malvina Hoffman, a great American sculptress, many of whose artworks are in the Chicago Field Museum. Her series on the studies of man, I forget the name of it. Anyway, she did a series of statues showing different ethnic groups, beautiful statues, famous statues. When she was 12 years old, her father took her to have lunch with Swami Vivekananda. And so, of course, she was a 12-year-old girl. She don't know how much interaction she had with him. She doesn't talk about much interaction, but she says that in 10 minutes in Swami Vivekananda's presence that she had with her father at lunch, she said, in 10 minutes in the presence of Swami Vivekananda, I learned far more about India than I have learned in the decades since after reading many volumes about India. So sitting in his presence for 10 minutes, she learned more about India than she learned the rest of her life by reading many books about India. So think about that. She wasn't some crazed person. She was a great artist and a very sensible person. But in her biography, her autobiography, she writes that. So Holy Mother said that he was the incarnation of India. She also said that it was Sri Ramakrishna himself who was working through Narendra. And it was the Holy Mother who really convinced the movement itself when many of Sri Ramakrishna's disciples, both monastic and lay, not all of them, but a number of them, monastic and lay disciples, thought that Swamiji was taking the movement in a different direction because they had understood Sri Ramakrishna in one way, only talking about God and meditation and absorption and ecstasy and singing and dancing and all of that. And here Swamiji was talking about organization. He was talking about rules and regulations for the organization. He was teaching about the Atman. He wasn't saying anything about Sri Ramakrishna as the divine incarnation come for the salvation of humanity. Nothing about that. Just teaching the principles of Advaita Vedanta and so forth. And so they thought, this is not the Sri Ramakrishna we knew. But it was Holy Mother who convinced all that no, it is Sri Ramakrishna who is working through Swamiji, who is directing, who is speaking through Swamiji's mouth. In fact, she told Swamiji that I see that it is Sri Ramakrishna that is doing everything through you, indicating that there was no difference between the two, essential difference between the two. And so he was much more than just an instrument. There was an identification that was there between Swamiji and Sri Ramakrishna. And similar, not the same, but similar to the identification between Holy Mother and Sri Ramakrishna. Swamiji said about himself that I am a voice without a form. I'm a voice without a form. Once Mrs. Ellen Waldo mentions when she was taking down dictation from Swamiji. The Swamiji was pacing up and down in the room. This was in New York City, dictating the Raja Yoga commentary to her. Every now and then he would stop in front of this full-size mirror and look at himself in the mirror. And then he would start pacing back and forth again, and then come back after a while and look at himself in the mirror. And Miss Waldo thought to herself, I see, even such a great person is subject to the weakness of vanity, admiring himself in the mirror. So even he has this human weakness. And so after a while, and doing this several times, Swamiji stopped and said, there's something very strange. While I'm walking up and down, I can't imagine what I look like. I go and see myself in the mirror, and then I start walking again, and all idea of my form disappears. So after some time, I go back and say, oh, that is what this looks like. Because he was so free from body consciousness, again, he said that I am a voice without a form. Extraordinary. But again, I mentioned that Swamiji never put himself in the category of the incarnations like Krishna and Ramakrishna, etc. But that doesn't mean that doesn't diminish his greatness. Once he was asked about the incarnation of Jesus, he said, it said that Jesus's birth was a virgin birth, that he wasn't born in the normal way, but his birth was a virgin birth. Is that possible? And Swamiji said, with God, anything is possible. God isn't restricted to the laws of the universe. Anything is possible. But as for me, I'm glad that I was born in the normal way. So Swamiji so identified with human beings that he would, and not just that time, there were other times also when he would say that I'm glad, as for me, I'm glad that I was born in the normal way, meaning that I am fully a human being, that I came in full human form, in full identity with human beings, without any distinction like that. He would say that I may have to be reborn again because you see, I have fallen in love with man. That is, I've fallen in love with humanity. Such was his identity with human beings. Once in New York, he was giving a talk. He started a talk, and suddenly, after he just began speaking, he turned away from the platform and went back behind stage. So Miss Josephine McLeod, his devotee, went running backstage to see what was the matter and said, Swamiji, what's the matter? Did you forget what you're going to say? And he said, no, I saw that the people in front of me were like wet clay in my hand, and I could give them any shape that I wanted. That is, he realized his great power to transform people. And he said, I respect human nature too much to take that freedom with them. So it was because he wanted each to grow according to the own law of their growth, because he saw that every being was divine. And he wanted that divinity to manifest itself according to that person's law of growth. He didn't want to take even that ability of a great spiritual giant, a world teacher, to mold people in the shape that he wanted to mold them in. He wouldn't do that. So Swami Subodhananda, one of the disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, he once, long after Swamiji had passed away, and a number of the other direct disciples had passed away, he was one of those. He lived until 1932. So a number had passed away. Swami Brahmananda and Premananda and various others had already passed away. So Swami Subodhananda had a vision in which he went to a very high realm. And there he found himself in the company of his brother disciples who had passed away, Swami Brahmananda and Adbhutananda and Turiyananda and Advaitananda and others. He found himself in this highly rarefied spiritual realm where they were. And he asked them, I see everyone, but I don't see Swamiji. Where is Swamiji? And they said, Swamiji is in an indescribable realm where he's one with God. And so then he realized again, as further proof of the fact that Swamiji was an extraordinary soul. Swami Akhandananda used to say that no one had the control over anger that Swamiji had. Sometimes when we read his life and his teachings and his letters, sometimes you see his severe scoldings he gave to people. And so some people get the idea that Swamiji was a hothead. But no, those who knew him said quite differently. Swami Akhandananda said no one had the control over anger that Swami Vivekananda did. He had the power to arouse the full force of his being behind any idea. And if he scolded someone, he did it for their good, to destroy some ignorance he saw within them, some narrow idea he saw within them. And he could summon the whole force of his being. And then he could appear quite terrible. But he did it for people's good. And it wasn't out of anger. Swami Paramananda has this to say. Swami Paramananda was the youngest monastic disciple of Swami Vivekananda, who later came to this country while he was still in his 20s. He came to this country and spent the rest of his life here. He said, have you not sometimes seen a face so transcendently, benignly beautiful that you cannot turn your eyes away from it? If you have not, I will not argue about it, for I myself have seen such a countenance, meaning Swamiji. And then the narrator a narrator says, again and again, Basanta, that was his Swami Paramananda's pre-monastic name, again and again, Basanta witnessed in the great Swami, Swami Vivekananda, gentleness almost like that in the heart of a young girl. One day, as they sat on the bathing ghat at Belur Math, a rough-hewn boat pulled up to the riverbank. A teenage boy, thin and in rags, alighted from the boat. Vivekananda, gazing intently, called the boy over to him and tenderly asked him questions about where he came from and the conditions there. As the boy described the plight of his native village, where food was scarce and disease rampant, Basanta saw the great teacher's eyes fill with tears, and Basanta realized that the lion of Vedanta had the heart of a lamb. And then Swami Paramananda continues his own words. I cannot begin to convey merely through words what my experience was with Swami Vivekananda. We imagine a great man as someone we cannot approach. Swami Vivekananda, however, was the simplest of people. It would have amazed you. His interior was like a child, gentle and mellow, and that was the real Swami Vivekananda. A great, loving heart. Sometimes, reading from his books, you do not quite get the picture. I have seen him weeping I have seen this great soul weeping when he thought no one saw him for the suffering of poor India. His heart was heavy with sadness because there was so much suffering in humanity. His heart was heavy. It is not this, not intellectuality, that makes people great. It was this which left an indelible impression on my mind that cannot be wiped out. And Sister Christine said about Swamiji, one of his American disciples who went to India like Nivedita at Swamiji's call. Now and then at long intervals of time, a being finds his way to this planet who is unquestionably a wanderer from another sphere, who brings with him to this sorrowful world some of the glory, the power, the radiance of that far distant region from which he came. He walks among men, but he is not at home here. He is a pilgrim, a stranger. He tarries but a night. He shares the life of those about him, enters into their joys and sorrows, rejoices with them, mourns with them, but through it all he never forgets who he is, whence he came, or what the purpose of his coming. He never forgets his divinity. He remembers that he is the great, the glorious, the majestic self, the Atman. He knows that he came from that ineffable supernal region which has no need of the sun or moon, for it is illumined by the light of all lights. He knows that he was, long before the time when all the sons of God sang together for joy. Such a one I have seen, I have heard, I have revered. At his feet I have laid my soul's devotion. Such a being is beyond all comparison, for he transcends all ordinary standards and ideals. Others may be brilliant, his mind is luminous, for he had the power to put himself into immediate contact with the source of all knowledge. He is no longer limited to the slow processes to which ordinary human beings are confined. Others may be great. They are great only as compared to those in their own class. Others may be good, powerful, gifted, having more of goodness, more of power, more of genius than their fellow men. It is only a matter of comparison. A saint is more holy, more pure, more single-minded than ordinary men. But with Swami Vivekananda, there could be no comparison. He was in a class by himself. He belonged to another order. He was not of this world. He was a radiant being who had descended from another, a higher sphere for a definite purpose. One might have known that he would not stay long. Is it to be wondered that nature itself rejoices in such a birth, that the heavens open and angels sing paeans of praise? Blessed is the country in which he was born. Blessed are they who lived on this earth at the same time. And blessed, thrice blessed, are the few who sat at his feet. And let me also read, before I close, from Josephine MacLeod. She says in her reminiscences, at the beginning of her reminiscences, all of which should be read, all of which are beautiful, but this small passage. On the 29th of January, 1895, I went with my sister to 54 West 33rd Street, New York, and heard the Swami Vivekananda in his sitting room, where were assembled 15 or 20 ladies and 2 or 3 gentlemen. The room was crowded. All the armchairs were taken, so I sat on the floor in the front row. Swami stood in the corner. He said something, the particular words of which I do not remember, but instantly to me that was truth. And the second sentence he spoke was truth. And the third sentence was truth. And I listened to him for 7 years, and whatever he uttered was, to me, truth. From that moment, life had a different import. It was as if he made you realize that you were in eternity. It never altered, it never grew. It was like the sun that you will never forget once you have seen it. So that was Swami Vivekananda. And yet, again, he was one who identified fully with human beings, who delighted in being a man among men, a man among humanity. Mr. Leggett, a businessman who got to know the Swami and became his host at Ridgely Manor in upstate New York, a good man, but a worldly wise businessman. He was one of the beginners of the wholesale grocery business, and very important in New York at that time and very wealthy. He was asked why a wealthy businessman like he should be so fond of Swami Vivekananda. And he said, I have never seen anyone with as much common sense as Swami Vivekananda. So again, he saw that in Swamiji. That's certainly not all that he saw, but that he saw in Swami Vivekananda, that I've never seen anyone with such common sense as Swami Vivekananda. So everyone sees Swamiji as they are able, and each view of him is true. And it's through seeing him through all of these different viewpoints that we can begin to understand something of the vastness, recognize our limitations, but something of the vastness that was Swamiji. So in conclusion, no one needs to worship Swami Vivekananda. No one even needs to like him. As he often said, he didn't come for name and fame. He didn't come for human adulation. He was one of those rare, very rare people who had extraordinary fame in his time, extraordinary adulation in his time, and yet he cared nothing for it. Once he was told, late in his career in America in 1900, he was warned that, Swamiji, if you talk like that, the way you spoke in this the lecture you just gave, if you talk like that again, then you will lose your audience. I don't know what the Swami had said, but he was warned that if you speak like that, you'll lose your audience. And the Swami said that, Madam, I have cleared whole halls in New York. Meaning, I don't care if I clear the audience. I'm here to speak the truth. As he said on other occasions, I have a message to give, as he wrote to Mary Hale. I have a message to give, and I will give my message no matter what the consequences. And so he said of himself that he and Sri Ramakrishna had not come for name and fame. It doesn't matter whether anyone even remembers who they were. He came to give truth. He came to give life. He came to give a new impulse for the rising civilization. The old civilization, the civilization which we have known, that is dying even as we speak. The old forms are dying. The old traditions are dying. But a new civilization is coming up. And he, in time, I feel sure without any doubt, will be seen. He and Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother together. But speaking now of Swamiji, that he, who contained Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother within him, he will be seen as the impulse which brought about the new birth of civilization, a new golden age of humanity. So I have found that over the decades of my relationship with Swami Vivekananda, that whenever I saw some limitation in him or saw something that I thought was a limitation, in time I found, no, that was my limitation. My limited understanding of him says more about me than it says about him, because within him there were no limitations. And in time, I feel sure that that impulse that he has given to the world will manifest more visibly than it is now. What we see now is the wreckage all around us, the old dying, the old forms dying, the old ways dying. We see the wreckage. But we don't see that it's the new which is trying to break through the soil, which is causing the wreckage. Yes, that is what's causing the wreckage all around us in civilization, in countries around the world, including this country. But it's because something new is trying to grow through the soil, pushing the old out of the way so that it can manifest. So with that, I will close. I'm long over time, and I won't ask for questions now. I won't take any questions. So let me just give announcements and then a closing. So for announcements, I don't. On Tuesday we will have the Bhagavad Gita class as usual at 7:30 in the evening, and on Thursday at 11 o'clock in the morning we will have the gospel class as always. Both of them live streamed. I don't remember what the topic is for next week, but I will know by next Sunday. So we will have the lecture at the usual time next week. So with that, we will close, and I'll give a closing chant. Om Dyo Shantihi Antariksham Shantihi Prithvi Shantihi Apa Shantihi Oshadaya Shantihi Vanaspataya Shantihi Vishwe Deva Shantihi Brahma Shantihi Sarvam Shantihi Shantireva Shantihi Sama Shantiredhi Om Shanti Shanti Shantihi. Peace is in the heavens, peace is in the sky, peace is on earth, peace is in the waters, peace in the plants and the trees. The gods are peace. Peace is the nature of truth. Peace alone, peace. May that peace, real peace, be with us all. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us and to all the beings of the universe.